Well, thank you, Lizzie, for the introduction. Thank you, David. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I am on Wiradjuri land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Nations people with us today. And also just to acknowledge that I am on land where sovereignty has never been ceded. So just before I start, I want to just acknowledge that the research that I'm going to talk about was funded by the Collier Charitable Fund back in 2019, and we've been developing this research since then, but certainly the data collection was funded by the Collier Charitable Fund, so we thank them for that. And also the research partners. So I led this research, but as Lizzie pointed out before, we also collaborate as well. So I collaborated with the Centre for International Research on Education Systems as part of this research, and also with the Careers Industry Council of Australia and the Create Foundation, who provide support and advocacy for children with experience of the out-of-home care system. So together we all worked on this project. So it was very collaborative and interdisciplinary as well. And really, I'd like to talk, I suppose, a little bit in this presentation about the origins of this research, where the idea came from. So my background is in law and criminology, and so most of my research does actually focus on what's happening within the criminal justice system, not so much the education system in careers and transitions, etc. But one of the areas where I particularly focus my research is the experiences of children with experience of the out-of-home care system and their involvement with the criminal justice system. So, and I'll go into a bit more detail on the next slide about who that group of children are. But essentially there are overrepresentation of particular groups of children within the criminal justice system. And I've been looking at, I suppose, the outcomes in a sense of like what happens when children from particular groups are involved in the criminal justice system, how does that impact their life outcomes, and then looking at that in terms of career trajectories as well. And also there's an area of study within criminology looking at desistance from crime, and that is reasons why people who might offend when they're young, what stops them from offending as they grow older. We know that a lot of children age out of committing crimes, but a lot of it's also to do with what is in place in their lives. So if there's a lot of research that demonstrates, particularly if you have access to education or employment, you're more likely to desist from crime. And so that's sort of an area where we might look at transitions into education, not just from school, but also in terms of from children who've had experience with the criminal justice system, and where there are divergent paths where one group of children might be more likely to transition to education, whereas others might be transitioning into the adult criminal justice system as well. So that's really the interest that brought me to this particular area of research, was looking at transitions, and rather than focusing on these transitions from youth justice to the adult system, but looking at the transitions into education. So this is where I partnered up with Lizzie and her expertise on career transitions. And what we do know from existing research is that parents have been shown to be a strong influence on career decision-making and successful transitions. So this gives us a place to start from when we look at what happens for people who do not have an active parent involved in their lives. Now, in terms of care experience, young people, they are less likely to have access to parental support. So that's why we looked at this group of children as a particular case study, because it's much more likely that they won't have a parent in their life at the time when they're transitioning either into higher education or leaving the care system, leaving home per se. And we also know that children with care experience have been shown, so care experience itself has been shown to be an indicator of less likelihood to progress into education, training, or employment. So if we take all these factors together, it makes it a really interesting case study to start from, to examine. So that's really where, I guess, the impetus for this research comes from. Just briefly, if you're not familiar, out-of-home care is when a child is removed from their family and placed with someone else. Now, this can take several different forms. It could be that they're placed with another family member. It could be that they're placed in a foster care situation, which is where there are carers living in a family-like situation. There might be other siblings that might be part of the existing family or other foster children. or it might be a form of residential care, previously known as group homes, for example. But essentially this is where you'd have paid carers working shift work and children living in a house. It's a house environment, but it's got sort of an institutional feel to it. And so a lot of my research is focused particularly on the residential care environment. But for this particular project, we looked a bit more broadly, just any experience of out-of-home care in that respect. Children might be removed from the family home for a number of different reasons. It might be because of abuse and neglect. It might be because of parental incapacity. It might be respite care during periods of challenges for parents. It might be due to the death of family members. So there are many different reasons. But we do know that trauma is a significant factor in the backgrounds of children who've been removed from their families. And that research has shown that children with experience of out-of-home care have poorer life outcomes in terms of education, health, and criminal justice as well. So we do know that there is some research in this area looking at, what happens once children leave care and their transition into adulthood, and what that looks like from the point of view of education. But we know that there's not a lot specifically looking at care experience in terms of higher education transitions. We know that there's not a national collection of data. So this is quite interesting in respect of recognition of the experience of children with out-of-home care. It's not recognised. You may be familiar with the Bradley report on factors of disadvantage recognised in higher education, and care experience is not recognised as a factor there. If we contrast this to the UK, there's been a lot more development in the UK in the last 10 years, where now data collection is much more prominent in relation to care experience. So there's a lot more recognition of people with care experience as a recognised marginalised group of people. Certainly, to an extent, this might be why there's not a lot of research in this area, because the problem is not necessarily recognised. There's not a lot of data available to look at. So just briefly, our research asked two key questions, and one was, are public educational institutions recognising the challenges of care experienced young people, and how are different parts of the sector supporting care experienced young people in the transition to higher education? And some of the things I'm going to be talking about in the findings from this project will speak to different aspects of those two questions. Just briefly, we used a layered technique and we had several different phases of our data collection. We did interviews in the field on transitions from institutions and transitions to institutions and support organisations. So we talked to people working in higher education, often involved in either marketing or providing student support. And also we spoke to organisations and government bodies representing or involved with children in out-of-home care, and what that means in terms of leaving care. We also conducted some public data collection by conducting a website analysis of universities' web pages about the support that's offered, and whether any particular mention was made of support for people with care experience. And also more generally, what kind of supports are available for people who might have challenges in things like finding accommodation, etc. We also conducted a survey of career practitioners as well about their awareness of care experience and any ways that they tailored their advice if they knew a person had care experience, for example. So the data was collected in several different ways. So we were pleased our industry partnership with Create meant that we were able to hire a person with care experience to conduct a website search to collect the data that was then put into an infographic, which I will show you shortly. As I said before, we did the semi-structured interviews with equity and diversity staff, marketing staff, and organisational representatives, and the survey of career practitioners. So just before I go to the infographic, I'll just talk you through what happened in the sense of when the person who was hired by Create went into the websites with the view of being someone who was aspirational to go to university and didn't know anything about the university and wanted to find out more. So that's what they were doing there. And it was notes were taken on things like how many times they had to click to find information, how easy it was in, on sort of the first landing page they got to, and any mentions there. And I'm just going to switch my sharing to the infographic, and hopefully you can now see the infographic there. It's not necessarily the right shape for this for this screen, but I'll scroll down. So we can see here, we put together this infographic with the basic information that came out of that website search. And I'll just briefly talk you through that. So we have here that we know 57% of care leavers now finish year 12, but only 32% of care leavers commence further education. That's from research conducted by CREATE. We did essentially a pathway that led from school to university, and I guess the infographics to show the kind of barriers that might be experienced on the way through that transition into a higher education career. So we know that care leavers and their supporters are not routinely provided information about higher education transition, and only New South Wales offers any information about higher education transition on their post-care information pages. So this was looking at what is available in terms of leaving care. And when people leave care, they are supposed to be given what's called a leave-in care plan. It might be called slightly different things in different jurisdictions, but essentially it's like, when somebody gets the age of generally 18 is when people age out of care, although Victoria has recently changed this to 21, there needs to be a plan put in place so that when they turn 18, they're not walking out the door of their care home and have nowhere to go to. So in a sense, care plans are often very much dealing with the immediate, I guess, survival issues, such as where are you going to sleep that night? How are you going to get money to buy food? So those are some of the things that are obviously very important to be covered. But what we do know from our interviews and from our previous research is that leave-in care plans, although they are supposed to be looking more broadly at aspirations and what people want to do and how to go about doing that, they really are, when they're done, which is some evidence to show that they're not always done or not always comprehensively done, that it really just focuses on survival and what's happening in the very immediate future, not a long-term planning and where people might go to find information and support. So this is very much consistent with the research, with the information that we found on the websites as well. In terms of targeted information on university websites for care experience people specifically, we did find that, as you can see here, there is some information available, but a lot of universities, up to 87% in terms of independent, emancipated young people, and 77% in terms of care experience young people, there's no information on university websites that addresses the needs of that particular group of people there. So certainly there was a distinct lack of information available via the universities themselves. Now, accommodation is a key priority for people leaving care and transitioning into higher education. So it was also, we looked at what accommodation was available, particularly for care leavers, knowing that they don't necessarily have a parental home that they can go back to. And if they've aged out of the care system, there's no mechanism in place to provide accommodation in that system either. And we found, we found that there was nothing specific from 31 out of the universities looked at, but only 3 had clear specialist support. So there was a small pocket of universities that actually had some quite targeted information and support available, but this was not generalized throughout the higher education system. So we could definitely say there's pockets of good practice from what we could find, but this was not a general experience. We know that universities do have equity scholarships, but not necessarily specifically for people with care experience. So as we can see, the majority of universities have some form of equity scholarship, but we only found 15 across 5 institutions that had specific scholarship or bursary schemes aimed at care leavers. So that's our infographic there, and we found that that's been quite useful, particularly for career practitioners, to have this information to hand. And if you did want a copy of this, it is freely available, so please get in touch with myself or Lizzie and we can provide a copy of it. and feel free to circulate amongst your networks as well, because I think it's really important that this information actually gets out there, because then people can, it's a starting base from where we can work from. I think is really important. I'm just going to go back to sharing my slides, and hopefully you're back to the slides again. So with the few minutes I've got left, I just want to talk about some of the considerations that came from our key themes. Now, understanding this is a research snapshot, so it's just these, I guess, the general kind of considerations that came from the things that we found through our interviews, from our website search, from our literature reviews, and from our survey with career practitioners. There are some practical considerations in terms of people with care experience, as we know, will have a lack of parental support. And in doing that transition to higher education, there can be some very simple practical barriers to actually being able to find out information about how to transition. So, for example, they may not have someone who could take them to open days, or even make them aware that open days exist, or how they're going to get there. So even just having a means of transport, or somebody who can help them to go and navigate that. A lot of information we've seen in terms of career transitions can use quite exclusionary language. So we do find that to an extent, institutions rely on parents to do a lot of the, I suppose, the assisting with the child or the young person to transition. So things could be addressed to parents. I know in my own institution, I think not that long ago, they had a parents information night for school leavers. So again, if you don't have a parent involved in your life, that can in and of itself, you feel excluded from that sort of thing, and not having anyone who might necessarily go on your behalf. As I said, also in terms of when you're transitioning out of care, and in my state of New South Wales currently it's the age of 18, the immediate focus will not be necessarily on long-term career planning and goals. It might be just more, where are you going to sleep tonight? So again, some of the more aspirational aspects get lost in the focus on survival. In terms of aspirations, one of the things that I found really interesting that came out of some of our interviews was the interview participants talked about a lot of the care kids not really knowing that university was a possible path for them, that they could go to higher education. No one has sort of said that that was an option for them. They didn't necessarily have adults in their lives who had experienced the higher education system themselves. So to an extent, they hadn't entertained these options, and nobody had kind of explored that. They also had not necessarily received any encouragement, particularly if we look at, say, the residential care environment, where there tend to be paid carers who are only a few years older than the young people themselves in these residential homes. That, again, the focus on just survival and getting through means that people aren't necessarily sitting down and talking to young people about what do you want to do with your life, and showing them the different kind of careers that are out there. There's some interesting anecdotal evidence. I'd like to explore this more in further research, that a lot of kids with care, or young people with care experience who do go on to higher education, go into things like social work degrees, because the person in their life who may have given them encouragement, who they know that has a career, is a social worker, because that's their exposure. So I think that would be very interesting. That's anecdotal from our interview data, but I think it'd be really interesting to explore this in a bit more detail as well. And another key aspect is the impact of trauma. And again, I'm going to cover this very briefly, but I think this needs to be unpacked a lot more, and particularly in relation to any professionals who might be interacting with people with care experience. We do know that trauma, many children, it's a very high rate of children who come into the out-of-home care system that experience trauma both prior to being removed from the family home, but also ongoing trauma whilst in care as well. And we do understand the impact and prevalence of trauma on young people can affect many different aspects of their lives. I've looked at it particularly in relation to the criminal justice system. This can be very much in terms of the way behaviours are responded to, the way children are perceived by actors in the criminal justice system, such as police, and how this can lead to criminalisation. But also this is probably important in terms of transitioning people into their future careers, as to how they are the impact of trauma in their lives, how trauma might be managed and how it might affect the way they experience, say, university, and how they might need to have additional supports in place when they're in the university environment, the higher education environment. So I think trauma-informed practice is going to be something that needs to be considered in all aspects, not just necessarily where we associate it with, say, the caring professions, for example, social work, but also anyone who might be interacting with people that may have a trauma background, and about how support and how practice should be responding to trauma. And just a few suggestions for practice. So again, for those of you, depending on what area you're in, you might have you might be providing career development resources, in which case I would really encourage you to consider making links with organisations that provide care and working out how to provide career development resources and information to carers and to young people. To bring career planning and more aspirational goals as a part of the transitioning out of care process, not just focusing on survival. Trauma-informed career practitioners, as I mentioned before. And in terms of the university's approach to diversity and equity, certainly collection of data, national collection of data, provision of services specific to the needs of care experienced people. And so we also talk a bit about this idea of looking at needs-based approaches rather than group-based approaches as well to support. That's pretty much the end of my time. So I just wanted to thank you for listening to this research snapshot. And I believe there's some time for questions and comments. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Emma. That was very beautifully delivered and really encompassed our research. And I think that there's some real findings in it. Now, I've got a couple of comments so far that I'm just going to share with you. And one is from Amanda McHugh. Thank you, thank you for doing such important work, ensuring our sector remains aware of underserved populations. The heartbreaking topic, which it is. And then from Tanya, will the presentation be made available to participants? I think that there's going to be a recording, but I might throw to David, who's actually off screen, because I'm not sure if Emma can answer that. But David, can you tell us?
So yeah, so the recordings of all of the snapshot series will be available on the Careers Week website next week, not the slides, though, just a copy of the recording. And I think to answer Leanne's question, who's looking for a copy of the infographic, in the comments section, which is attached to this recording, we'll actually provide a copy of the research report and the infographic.
Yeah, thanks, David. That's great. And just any other questions in the section there? I haven't got any questions for you, Emma, because I know the answers and I don't want to think. I could ask you as a leading question, or David, do you have any questions? No. What's next in this research?
Well, so one of the key themes that really came out of the research was the way that parents are kind of responsibilized through our systems. And we're kind of unpacking a bit more about this concept of the parent and the reliance of the parent and what that means in terms of divergent outcomes for children who don't have a parent who's able to take on those roles. Now, we're looking at children with care experience as a particular case study because of the likelihood that they won't have necessarily a parent or adult in their lives who is able to take on that role. But more broadly, this could be applied to children who have parents that are disinterested or disengaged as well. But what we're trying to understand is when the state is putting and through institutions putting all this responsibility onto parents, so as I said before, you know, there's more and more expectation that parents will be actively doing things to kids, and the marketing to universities is increasingly sort of talking to parents rather than their children. Then what is the impact of that? This is where we see a real gap emerging for people who don't have that in their lives. And so what we're going to be doing is much more, I guess, a theoretical work about unpacking what a parent is in terms of, you know, how they support transitions. And that's really where we're going with that. So, yeah.
Could luck with that work, Emma. I hope it goes well for you. No, I'm doing a lot of that work with Emma. Emma, there's a question in the chat. It sounded quite heavy going, but the question is very useful and helpful. I think it says, Leanne's not sure if we have this data, but is there any difference between cultural groups in out-of-home care?
Well, I suppose one of the key areas of overrepresentation is children from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background. We know that now more children are being removed from their family homes than were during the stolen generation. So this is a really significant area. And when we look at the intersection of experience of the out-of-home care system, identifying as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person, and involvement in the criminal justice system, is where there's a real overlap and overrepresentation. So it's a really critical group of people who are needing support and understanding about what's happening there and how to address some of those really critical factors. So that's one particular aspect it's probably the most prominent one. And in my research, is a lot of what we focus on is the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care and the criminal justice system. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, Leanne.
It did, thanks, says Leanne. That's great, and there's thanks for raising awareness and an important topic. And Emma, I just thought you'd like to know there are a couple of people who are involved in working in this space that we've talked to, Natasha Jibke and Sandra Silva, who work particularly, which is I'd like to call out their practice work in this space, which is excellent. There's some Meredith asked any information about refugee young people, and I would also direct you, Meredith, to yesterday, who Payman Abkazir talked about support for, and you'll see the recording on the page. But is there an intersection of that work, Emma, of refugee young people in care and unaccompanied?
Not yet from that I'm aware of, but it is actually another area. It's an area where I'm exploring with another colleague who does a lot of work on immigration, what's called crimmigration, and the way that refugees are criminalized, in terms of, being kept in detention. And there is a small new seam of research, particularly from the UK, about unaccompanied minors and their experience of out-of-home care, and we're seeing some involvement in the criminal justice system there. And I think that that's something that needs to be looked at here. So I think that is also a potential future avenue of research as well. But certainly there is a bit of information coming out of the UK on that, but I haven't looked at it specifically myself yet, but I'm interested in it. So thanks, Meredith.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much for your time, Emma, and keep warm up there in Bathurst.
So -3 this morning.
Thanks again, David, and back to you.